Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey guys, we're glad to have you listening to another episode this week. As per usual, if you like what you hear, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Nick, how's it going this week?
Man, it's going great. I feel like it's a good way to start our week. It's like Tuesday when we're recording this time, but it's always so good to be able to like sit down and have our discussions. For everybody who's kind of listening along with us, we kind of sit and just chat for a little bit before we get started and start like thinking about what we're going to say. And it's just, man, you're such a blessing. I appreciate you. And it brings a bright spot to my week, and I appreciate that. I was thinking about the boys earlier. We were having some discussions about like who all we were talking to and gonna see and stuff. And I brought up Mr. Cody, and Judah was like, "Oh yeah, because he knows." And so because they listen to us sometimes too in the car and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm good. We're good. Everything's going good. How about you?
Man, I wish I had something as heartfelt, but Michigan basketball is what's on my mind. We're recording this a week early because I'm going to be gone next week. But yesterday we finally got it done. It's been a long time coming, so that's been on my mind. And just we had a good weekend here with the church, and just good things are happening. Good things are happening all around. So it's just really wonderful to just be a part of all the things that God has going on. I think one thing that has been made evident to me a lot lately is just how even when you don't like quite see the whole picture, he's always moving. Even when you don't think that the stuff that you're doing is all that effective, he's effective. His word's effective. He's always able to, he's always in the business of saving souls. We've had several baptisms lately. And I think I told you the other week that it's like, man, when I really think about it, it's like I didn't even have all that much influence with any of them. It's like, but the Lord is working through all these other people, all these wonderful people that are working here. And like I said, it's just awesome to be able to see God working and God moving. Again, even when we don't quite understand exactly what he's doing. And that really is going to play into what we're talking about today in chapters 7 and 8 of the book of Mark. Today, we have so many different like little sections that I actually had to write them down to make sure that at least we touch on all of them. We may not be able to go into detail on all of the different sections, but I do, as we're here in the intro, I do want to make sure that we mention it. So it starts out at the beginning of 7, the Pharisees and the scribes, they come up to Jesus and they're upset with his disciples that they're not going through the ceremonial washing of hands. There's just that tradition. This is just what we do, and they're not doing that. And obviously that's causing a lot of problems. They haven't been too keen on Jesus already. We saw a few chapters ago, they said that they wanted to kill him, and they're plotting on that. So this is just, it's almost like it's adding a little bit of fuel to the fire. But really, by them bringing up this washing of the hands stuff, what Jesus will point out is they're actually exposing something like a deeper flaw within themselves. And so there's that section. Then a Gentile mother comes up to Jesus and is asking for Jesus to cast a demon out of her daughter, which is something we've seen Jesus exercising his authority over demons already. We've even seen him having interactions with those who were Gentiles. But this story is a little different, where she asks Jesus and he says no. Now she's persistent and he ends up saying yes, but I think there's a lot to learn from that. And then there are miracles here. You have Jesus doing multiple healings. He'll heal a man who's blind and deaf. Then he's healing a blind man. And there's the feeding of the 4,000 that's in this section too. So we're seeing Jesus' miraculous authority and power on display. And then in chapter 8, there are a couple of stories where clearly the disciples just don't get it. So things like the Pharisee and the leaven, there's a question that they ask there. Peter, he doesn't get it so much that he actually rebukes Jesus for something that Jesus says after he predicts his death. Peter's like, no, come here. You can't say that, because he doesn't get it, right? He doesn't understand the full picture. So there's stories where they don't get it, but man, there's stories where they do, right? There's stories where that same Peter is professing that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Which is like ultimate level of understanding. So there's just a progression that's going on there. And I think Jesus' point in the whole thing is, hey, keep your mind on the spiritual things and you'll be able to get to where you need to be. And so we've been focusing on authority in this season, and we're going to continue to do that today. We're as we're looking at Jesus' authority, first we want to be convicted by that authority and say, you know what, well, I need to live that way. I need to understand these things and adjust my life accordingly. But also we want to be comforted by Jesus' authority too, where we want to understand, hey, if Jesus has the authority to cast out demons, well, he has the authority to take care of things in my life too. And so, Nick, we're looking at authority. Like I said in the beginning, we're not going to go super neatly here, but are there any stories here that help highlight Jesus' authority?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this when we were prepping and stuff, is you could just go through like every single story and highlight how this ties back to Jesus' authority in some way. And I think that you can do that as you're reading through along with us too, like just to kind of notice like the grand theme that I see in Mark is Jesus is Lord. He's the king, right? And what type of authority? He has all authority. And that really factors into our first story. And that's where we're going to start today, isn't it? Right here in chapter 7, the first few verses here of chapter 7, because the Pharisees like the authority that they have.
Sure.
And they don't want to acknowledge Jesus as having more authority. Cody's already mentioned, like we've already read, like they're looking for ways already to kind of get rid of him. They don't want him coming in because he was teaching as somebody who had authority. He, like, so that you know that I have authority to forgive sins. He's healing people with this authority. Well, that's beyond the scope of what the Pharisees can do. And so now the Pharisees are like, all right, let's pick apart this guy, right? Like, so they come to his disciples and they come to him and they say, we noticed, we've seen some of his disciples. They're not doing things the way that we teach you to do things or the way that the elders have taught this should be done. This is just customary, right? Like we should do this. Now, I should point out, like, again, these are customs that had been started in order to prevent people from coming too close to actually breaking the law of God. So they're not talking about God's law here. They're talking about, again, the customs, the traditions of elders. And so they came from Jerusalem, right? The center of where the law is determined. What's right and wrong is determined in Jerusalem, right? Like if you're living in the first century, right? And they come to Jesus and they make this statement, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of elders, but they eat their bread with impure hands? And Jesus doesn't specifically answer that. He doesn't say what he could say, which is, hey guys, they're walking with the Son of God. If they were doing something wrong, don't you think I would have told them that they were doing something wrong? But that's not the problem. The problem is the heart of the person who's accusing Jesus. Because if you're accusing God of doing something wrong, that's putting you on the accuser's side, which is Satan, right? And so now he's going to call them out. He's like, you're hypocrites. You honor me with your lips, but your heart is far away from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. Like your worship doesn't even matter because your heart is not really trying to serve God. Because if their heart had been trying to serve God, they would have recognized Jesus as, here's our thought, right? They would have recognized his authority and they would have submitted to that, and they wouldn't be questioning his authority in front of his followers to try to like lessen his influence, which is really what they're trying to do, right? Like they're trying to poke holes in who Jesus is. Well, you're not doing things our way, so you can't be from God. And Jesus says, man, this is so sad. This is so sad that your heart is so hard that you cannot see who I am. You hold to these traditions, but you're neglecting God's commandments. You're neglecting his son. And so we see that. And so he keeps going in this, and he emphasizes again, you are experts at setting aside the commandment of God. And that's an indictment in order to keep your tradition. Like, you are really good at this. Like, you've got it down to a science. And his example here in this section is like, you will allow somebody to say, like, the command says, honor your father and mother, and who speaks evil of his father and mother should be put to death. But you will say that if somebody gives what they should use to take care of their father and mother to the temple, that is Corban, they're going to give it to God, then they're excused from helping their father and mother. So like, you created these like sneaky, elegant workarounds to make it look like you're worshiping God and giving something to God. You're really breaking God's command. And so again, not only did they not want to recognize Jesus' authority, but the way that he's pointing out their heart condition shows the true type of authority that he has, shows that he can see their hearts and he understands who they are. And really, like, they're showing themselves to him and to everyone. Like, this is who they are. And that's a really sad thing. I think you see the sadness of Jesus. I think you see sometimes I've read this section by seeing like the frustration of Jesus here. I don't know. I think I read it as like, here is the King of Kings, and I think he's disappointed. I think there's sadness here that like what they're doing, it's not only that they're leading other people away, but they themselves can't even see how hard their heart is to the actual commands of God. So then he calls the crowd to himself, and he says this, and I'm going to read this portion here, starting in verse 14. After he called the crowd to him again, he began to say, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." So he kind of teaches in a parable here. Then the crowd leaves, and he goes in, and the disciples are saying, like, what does this mean? What are you talking about? And then you start to see, like, are you not understanding too? Do you have a hard heart too? Do you not understand the significance that what is coming from us, our actions? He goes on and he says, like, fornication, theft, murders, evil thoughts, adulteries, all these things, they come from inside of us. Like, they start in your heart, and they show the type of person that you really are. So your actions come from within. And so sometimes we might see this and we say, like, okay, Jesus, I hear what you're saying. Or somebody accuses us of doing something we shouldn't do. Say, yeah, but that's not who I really am. I think the Pharisees would have been that type of person. Like, no, Jesus, you got it wrong. Like, we really do want to worship God. We really do have a heart that's committed to him. And Jesus is saying, that's not what your heart is saying based on your actions. The fact that you would neglect the commandments of God. In our case, whenever we sin or whenever we are compelled to do something that's against God's will and we try to justify it, that says something about our heart. Because a heart that wants to do God's will would be a contrite heart that would be humbled and deeply desire to make things right with God. And that all comes into play here where the Pharisees should have humbled themselves. Yep. Knowing the authority of God, seeing what Jesus is able to do and saying, Lord, forgive us, right? We are wrong. Like they should want to be right in Jesus's eyes. Instead, they want Jesus to be right in their eyes. Unfortunately, we may approach worship that way. We may approach our lives that way, our marriages that way. Maybe we want everybody to be right in our eyes instead of us trying to be right in Jesus's eyes. So, Cody, I don't know, like that's the first thing that jumped out to me. You want to add anything in that?
Yeah, it's just it's kind of, I guess, scary in a sense to think that like, that whole mess really does funnel back to that not understanding Jesus' authority. So they, in this situation, are trying to, like you just said, they're trying to emphasize their own authority, like flex their own muscle versus Jesus. And I just think, like, man, I wonder how often it is that as we're trying to, administer judgment or apply some law or command, some sort of man-made tradition. I wonder if there are times where in our haste to, let what we think be known, I wonder how many times do we try to supersede what Jesus says? Because I mean, in this case, especially with the honoring of the father and mother, like their law literally goes, like they can't actually fulfill the law based on what they've set up. And at that point, things are just all out of line. So I think that's a reminder for all of us, a sobering reminder for all of us at some point we got to step back and see, okay, am I trying to enforce Jesus' will and his authority, or is this really my own? And I think that does take some time to step back and really kind of think through that. The section I wanted to highlight at least first is at the end of chapter 7, 31 down through the end. There's this really strange story where this man comes up to Jesus and he can't speak, or he has difficulty speaking, and he's deaf. And we've seen Jesus heal people before, but I think this is one of these escalating types of miracles that's showing even more of Jesus' authority as he's doing these miracles. But in the way that he heals them, there's just this really weird scene where he puts his fingers in the guy's ears. It says that he spits and then he touches his tongue with the saliva, and it's just like, it sounds pretty gross. And then he groans out Epaphatha, which means be opened. And it's at that point, that's when this man is healed. But I think the thing that we really need to see from that is, regardless of the strangeness of the story behind it, and I'm glad that the blind man or the deaf man allowed Jesus to do all this, right? Because we get this incredible story. He gets all this healing that comes from it. But I think we're supposed to see I think this is the first time we've seen Jesus take care of two physical issues with one miracle. That's not to say that the other miracles that he was doing weren't awesome, because they were. And I think each one has its own like flavor of awesomeness and own flavor of highlighting Jesus' authority. But here we've got a man who can't hear and he can't speak. And after one interaction with Jesus, as Jesus exercises his authority in that man's life, both of them are taken care of. And so even in this admittedly stranger story towards the end of chapter 7, what we're seeing is Jesus' authority. And it's like, hey, even if we think we have one thing or two thing or 10 things wrong, hey, if we invite Jesus in and we submit to his authority, guess what? He has the power to work those things out. So what else? What else you got? We got a lot of ground to cover today.
A lot to cover. Yeah. But I think with that, like, it ties back into the story just before it too, because it's like, well, that deaf man could have said, no, I don't want any part of what you're about to do. Like, that's kind of gross and weird to me. But this is the King of Kings, and he's saying, I can heal you. And so then you submit to whatever it is. And that kind of ties back into the Gentile mother here, that Jesus, again, and we should say, like, he did not come specifically for the Gentiles. That comes later in the book of Acts as we're working through the gospel and the kingdom spreading. But he goes here, honestly, to kind of catch a break from the crowds. And even the Gentiles can see how great the stuff he is and have heard these stories, and they come to him. And this mother comes and she keeps asking and she keeps asking. You have this like interesting interaction. And I want to emphasize just one part of it, right? Just in this story, I think to show even the people who sometimes it's the least likely people who recognize Jesus' authority, I think is what I want to say there. And this would be one of those instances where here's this Gentile, not a Pharisee, not a Jew, not somebody who knew the law necessarily, but she comes to him and he first says no, and maybe like more than once based on the context. She answers and says to him after he turns her down, he says, "Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord." I love that. Here's humility and here's a recognition of his authority, right? Who he is. But even the dogs under the table feed the children crumbs, right? Like, I will take your crumbs. And I love that. I was saying this beforehand. I think this is so true. I think when we come to a place in our heart that says, Lord, I will take whatever crumbs you have, that will be enough. That's the type of humility. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. Because so often we come to the Lord expecting greatness because he's able to do great things. But how often do we come to the Lord just saying, whatever you have, I'll take it? And really, like, what he has is salvation. What he has is a kingdom. What he has is like the ability for us to receive an inheritance. It's all great and amazing. But what we need to have is humility. And I think that's what jumped out to me in that section. So I was just like tying those two things together was really cool. So as we kind of keep working through this, we just see different little pieces of what it looks like to recognize Jesus as the King, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll jump down to chapter 8. There's a situation there where there's these 4,000 people. Actually, first it just says there's a large crowd that is around Jesus, but later on we know that it's 4,000 people. And they have nothing to eat. And then Jesus calls the disciples. He says, hey, have compassion on them. They're hungry. They don't have anything to eat. Now, that should sound very familiar, right? We got a large crowd out in a deserted place, nothing to eat. We saw him feed 5,000 people. That's just 2 chapters ago at this point. And so you would think after Jesus says that, the disciples should say, okay, well, like, do another miracle, something like that. Feed these people like he fed the last ones. But in verse 4 of chapter 8, his disciples answered him, where can anyone get enough bread in this desolate place to feed these people? And this is one of the funniest verses in the Bible to me, because I can just see like the look on Jesus' face. I just fed 5,000 people. We don't know how many days ago that was, how long ago, but y'all saw that, right? Now we actually have less people, and somehow y'all don't get it. And I think it's because the disciples they're very clearly going through this process of they're learning a lot of things. I think for the context of our discussion today, they're really learning the depth of Jesus' authority, and they're supposed to be able to kind of understand the knowledge over here and say, okay, well, if Jesus can do this, then he should be able to do this. If he can feed 5,000, he should be able to feed 4,000. But unfortunately, I won't say that the process is not happening, but maybe it's happening a little slower than it should be. They're coming to this understanding, and we see that a little bit even after Jesus feeds the 4,000 there. Later on, he's talking about like watching out for the leaven of the Pharisees, and they're sitting back thinking, "Oh man, yeah, we didn't bring any leaven for bread." And Jesus is like, "Wait a minute. Are y'all still stuck on this bread thing? Like, I've already shown you what I can do, from this physical standpoint. I've already shown you it doesn't matter if it's, just us 13, we got 4,000, 5,000. I can take care of all that. But you guys are going to need to kind of recalibrate your thinking to start focusing more on these spiritual things. Because the leaven that Jesus was talking about was the leaven, the influence of the Pharisees, the guys who were causing the problems in the last chapter. And he doesn't want them to be able to influence the disciples. And so he's like, hey, for that's what you guys need to be paying attention to. But they're going through this process of learning and coming to a greater understanding. And I think the last story, or the story from 22 to 26 of the healing of the blind man, I think it helps to add a little bit of clarity to what's really going on with these disciples as far as why they don't quite understand that Jesus can do these things. Because in that story, the blind man, it says they brought a blind man to him and he begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and took him out of the village, spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him. He asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up. "I see people. They look like trees walking." Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes. The man looked intently and his sight was restored and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." So this man who's blind, Jesus comes to him, spits on his hands, puts his hands on his eyes. And then he has like a temporary, or a small sense of sight where he's like, okay, I kind of see some things. I think these are people that kind of look like trees. And Jesus touches his eyes again. And now he's got the full sight, right? So that represents the understanding and the growth in understanding that these disciples are going through here. Where yes, they're understanding some things and some really, really important things, but there's still a ways to go as far as really understanding Jesus' authority and what that's going to look like played out. And I think that's okay, right? There's nothing here that says and Jesus was done with the disciples, right? And Jesus sent them away and got 12 brand new ones, right? No. It didn't work like that. He understands that some of this stuff is a progression, but I think my point is for all of us, in order for us to be able to go through that process of coming to a greater understanding of his authority and all these things, we've got to have the right types of hearts. Because meanwhile, while these disciples are growing in their understanding of Jesus, we also have the Pharisees that are not. Right? We have the Pharisees that are saying the exact same things over and over and over again. And instead of growing closer to Jesus, it's just making them more upset. Right? They're getting more antagonistic against Jesus. They're trying to fight against him more and more and more. And so for us, I think we're going to be in the same position that if we want to understand Jesus, we want to understand the message of the gospel, it might take us some time. We might have to get a couple different teachers that come in to help move us along. And I think all that is well and good. But man, if we're really not interested, if we're really not putting Jesus first, we don't have the right types of hearts, it's going to be a hard process. And I think the end of that process is probably going to be a hardening of our hearts that sets us against Jesus. And if we've seen how Jesus' authority works all through this book so far, we do not want to be against his authority in any kind of way. So you have those three stories there that really all go together. And Mark just does a really good job of putting these stories together to highlight different things. But the feeding of the 4,000, the leaven of the Pharisees, and the blind men, they all show this gradual progression in understanding Jesus' authority.
Yeah, and really, I think you get maybe the next step in that when you get what I think is the middle point of Mark's gospel, and you see it with Matthew's too, but it's here is the disciples being called, asked, "Who am I?" So the Pharisees won't acknowledge that Jesus is even sent from God. They won't acknowledge any authority that he has. So they're not even getting, going back to your blind man reference, they're not even getting the blurry trees, right? If we think about what the blurry trees are, the blurry trees are, I think, even acknowledging Jesus is Christ. He is King. He is Lord. He is the anointed one. And so Jesus just says, "Who do people say I am?" Well, people see that you have authority. People, John the Baptist, Elijah, the prophets, they see you're somebody from God. And he said, "Okay, but who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ." and he warned them to tell no one about him. It's like they do understand who he is. And then like we'll see in just like right on the heels of that, like Peter's already gonna like not fully understand. But really, like that's the point. Like what you said is exactly it, because even all the way into the book of Acts, like Peter, all the way into chapter 10, is having things revealed to him to help him fully understand things that Jesus was teaching him while he was on the earth, right? And I think that's really helpful. I think we're that way. And I know that I know that I'm that way. It's like this process of continuing to be in the Word, continuing to study and learn and know is a process of coming to say, I know who Jesus is. Good. Do I know to what extent that means I have to change my life to be like him? Or do I know to what extent that's calling me to follow him? It gets clearer and clearer the more we study, the longer we're disciples, the more we grow closer to him. And so we see all of that. And I think that signifies like just that point that you were already making. Like here is Peter saying, you are the Christ. All right. We got the blurry vision, right? Like now let's get more specific as we get closer to the cross. I'm going to need Jesus to say, and I'm going to need you to understand exactly what that means as we get there. And they don't fully, but they get there, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because he does start to paint the picture for him. Because, I mean, they do a great job of getting to this Messiah because not everybody's there. And in fact, you know, people moving forward, people are going to lose their lives for saying Jesus is the Messiah. So this is, I mean, huge claim, and we can't diminish that in any kind of way. But then Jesus does start adding layers into what that role as a Messiah, what his role as authority looks like. And it looks like him being rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes to be killed and to rise after 3 days. And that's too much for Peter. You know, Peter brings him aside and says, hey, no. Hey, we got some motion here. We can't be predicting death, you know? And I don't know all the reasons why he did that, but I just do know it was too much for him. That didn't fit with what his understanding was. And he's actually sternly told, get behind me, Satan. You were not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns. And I think that statement right there gives us the clue into like what the pivot is, right? If we have our minds on God's concerns, even if we don't understand things, there's a path for us to come to a greater understanding and for him to reveal those things to us. But if our minds are on human concerns, at some point, it's going to bump into something, right? It's not going to be able to coexist with how we're thinking. In fact, we already saw that with the Pharisees back in chapter 7, right? It just won't fit. So we gotta put all that stuff away and say, Lord, I just want what you want, right? I want to submit to your authority. And yeah, that might be a bumpy road. Yeah, it's going to result in you being killed. And maybe it might result in some challenges for me in my life that I don't necessarily anticipate or may not even enjoy, but I trust you, right? Because Jesus didn't just say he was going to be killed. I don't know why they always miss this, but he says I'm going to be, persecuted, rejected, betrayed, and then I'm going to rise on the third day. Okay, and they, for some reason, they never pay attention to that part of it. I don't know what that's about, but yes, there's trials. Yes, there's struggles to submitting to God's authority, but there's always the reward at the end. He always takes care of those who are faithful to him. We've seen that going all the way back to the very beginning, and we will continue to see that, as long as there are people. But the only way to get to that understanding is to understand, hey, this is God's authority. And even if he's exercising it in a way that I don't quite get, that's okay. I can walk by faith because I trust him and I trust in his authority. Nick, you want to wrap us up here with some reflections?
Yeah, I think our reflection is just that. We need to reflect on what we're willing to give up, what we're willing to endure. And that's how the chapter ends in chapter 8, right? If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So there is a reward. If anyone loses his life, if anyone wishes to save his life, will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Like, here's what we want to focus on this week, right? We need to understand what Jesus is calling us to. We need to realize that like humility is at the center of that. But it's humility because we understand the greatness of God and we put ourselves in the right place in connection to God and his son, Jesus, who is the King. And so then we are denying ourselves so that we can serve. And then I want us to just reflect a little bit on the thought of being ashamed. He said, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him. Are we ashamed of the King? Are we ashamed of claiming him as the King? And maybe as we just reflect this week, our big reflection is like, are we so ashamed that we're giving up our soul for something that's really temporary?
Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. If you like this episode, give it a like, a share, or even a comment to let us know how we're doing. We hope we've helped you think, reflect, and be honest about your relationship with God, and we can't wait to see you again next week.